The whole town in Duluth, Minnesota warned him to stay away, and now he knows why. An old broke veteran named Frank Walker, wearing the same thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, was thrown out into winter with two kids who had no one left. With only a battered backpack, a rusted fishing knife, and his loyal German shepherd, Bear, he disappeared into the frozen hills, hoping the woods would be kinder than people. But when Bear suddenly started barking at the cave floor near the icy pond, Frank realized the cave wasn't just a shelter. It was hiding something. A sealed-off space behind stone. A forgotten room buried by time, storms, and silence. And what they uncovered inside wasn't just a way to survive the cold. It was a secret that could expose a man's betrayal, shame an entire town, and change their lives forever. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below, because it's always wild to see how far these stories travel. Winter in Duluth, Minnesota came off Lake Superior like a cold God's breath, sharp enough to cut through pride and prayer. Frank Walker had learned long ago that cold wasn't just weather, it was a language. It spoke in creaking wood, in glass that sweated ice, in the way a man's bones complained before the sky even turned gray. Frank was an old veteran, late 60s, built like a weathered fence post still standing, even after the storms had taken everything pretty off him. His shoulders were broad but slumped with time, and his hands were thick-knuckled, scarred, the kind of hands that didn't belong to office work or comfort. A trimmed salt and pepper beard framed his jaw like a stubborn shadow that refused to leave, and his eyes, pale and tired, held that particular veteran look, not angry all the time, just alert, as if the world might still explode without warning. He wore the same heavy red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket almost every day, the fabric faded at the elbows, the collar worn soft from years of wind and work. It wasn't fashion, it was armor. It smelled faintly of smoke and pine and the kind of loneliness that settles into cloth. The old house he lived in sat on the edge of town, not far from the hills that rose like hunched shoulders against the sky. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't even respectable anymore. The paint peeled in long, tired strips, the porch sagged slightly, and the windows rattled when the wind got mean. But it was home. It was where Frank had brought his sister's children after the funeral, after the sheriff's quiet voice and the paperwork that made grief official. He had not planned on raising kids again. He had planned on disappearing into his own silence, letting his memories grow old and brittle like dried leaves. But life had laughed at his plans, as it always did. Noah was 14, long-limbed and tense, with dark hair that always fell into his eyes like he was trying to hide from the world. He had the sharp cheekbones of someone who hadn't eaten enough good meals lately, and his mouth was usually set in a hard line that said, "Don't try me." He was the kind of boy who carried his pain like a weapon, because if you didn't hold it tightly, it might turn on you. He didn't cry easily. When he did, he'd do it in the bathroom with the faucet running, as if water could cover shame. Lily was 8, small and thin as a winter branch, with light brown hair that curled at the ends and cheeks that still held a trace of childhood softness, even when the rest of her looked too fragile for the season. She had big eyes that watched everything, doors closing, voices changing, adults shifting their weight when they lied. She clutched a worn stuffed rabbit everywhere she went, its pink fur faded to a tired blush, one ear bent, the stitching along the belly loose like it had survived its own wars. Lily didn't understand money or deeds or legal ownership, but she understood fear. She understood when a room stopped feeling safe. And through all of it, through the empty chairs at the table and the nights when grief came back like a wolf, there was Bear. Bear was a German shepherd, 5 years old, heavy-chested and tall, with a thick coat that looked like it had been painted by the woods themselves. Black saddle over tan fur, a proud tail, and ears that never seemed to rest. His eyes were amber and intelligent, not just dog smart, but watchful, like he could read the mood of a room before the humans could. He moved with the steady confidence of an animal that believed his job was sacred. Bear didn't bark much. When he did, it meant something. Frank had found Bear years ago behind a gas station, skinny and limping, a chain mark around his neck like someone had tried to own him the wrong way. Frank didn't save Bear with speeches. He saved him with quiet. A bowl of food, a blanket, a hand that didn't flinch. Since then, Bear had followed him like a vow. That morning started with a sky the color of dirty wool and a wind that slapped the siding like it wanted inside. Frank was at the kitchen sink, watching frost creep along the glass like a slow white disease, when Bear's head lifted. Not barking, just listening. Frank's body reacted before his mind did. Years of service had carved reflexes into him deeper than thought. He turned, one hand already reaching for the old fishing knife he kept on the counter, not because he wanted trouble, but because the world had taught him to expect it. Then came the sound, tires crunching on frozen gravel, a truck door, boots on the porch. Noah looked up from the table, his shoulders tightening. Lily's rabbit disappeared into her arms as she hugged it tighter. Bear stood, muscles rolling under fur, and went to the door without being told. The knock was not gentle. It wasn't violent either. It was the kind of knock a man gives when he thinks he owns the air around him. Frank opened the door, and there he was, Ray. Uncle Ray wasn't old like Frank, but he wasn't young either. Mid-40s, broad across the chest, face rough from work and bad habits. He had a thick brown beard that grew wild along his jawline, and his eyes were a flat gray that didn't warm up even indoors. He wore a canvas work jacket dusted with salt stains and dried mud, and his boots looked like they had stomped on kindness for sport. Ray had the posture of a man who liked being the loudest thing in the room, even when he spoke quietly. He didn't greet the kids. He didn't ask how they were holding up. He looked past Frank into the house the way a banker looks at a foreclosed property measuring value, not history. "Morning," Ray said, but it sounded like a warning. Frank didn't step aside. "Ray," he replied, voice calm. Calm was the only weapon that didn't rust. Ray's gaze flicked to Bear. "Dog's still here." "Dog's family," Frank said. Ray's mouth twitched like he almost smiled, but the expression died before it was born. He held a folder in one hand, thick with papers. "We need to talk." Noah stood up, chair scraping the floor too loud in the small kitchen. He was trying to look grown, but his hands were clenched so tight his knuckles turned pale. "You can talk out there," Noah said. Ray's eyes slid to Noah, amused in a cruel way. "Boy's got a mouth on him." Frank's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Say what you came to say." Ray stepped inside anyway, as if the house had already agreed to let him. Cold air followed him like a curse. Lily stayed behind Frank's leg, peeking out like a frightened bird. Ray opened the folder and pulled out papers, tapping them with one thick finger. "This house ain't yours," he said. "Was your sister's and her husband's. Now it's mine." Noah's face flushed red. "That's our mom's house," he snapped, voice cracking at the edges. Ray shrugged like the boy was complaining about weather. "Was. Bills don't care about tears. Mortgage don't care about funerals. Paperwork's done. Frank felt something in his chest tighten. Not surprise, not exactly. More like recognition. He had seen men take what wasn't theirs before. Sometimes with guns. Sometimes with pens. "You can't do that," Lily whispered. So small it almost disappeared. Ray looked at her, and for a second his eyes softened, then hardened again, like he remembered he didn't want to be seen as human. "Kid," he said, "I didn't sign up to raise 3 mouths that ain't mine. Food ain't free. Heat ain't free. And I'm not about to go broke playing hero." Noah took a step forward, fists raised like he wanted to swing. Frank put a hand out, not touching him, just stopping him with the weight of authority. "Ray," Frank said, "you want the house? Fine. But you don't throw children out in winter." Ray's expression flattened. "Watch me." He dropped 3 backpacks on the floor like he was tossing trash. "You got an hour. Take what you need." The words didn't come with shouting. That was what made them worse. They came like a judge's sentence, final, cold. Noah's breathing turned fast. Lily started to cry, quiet at first. The way kids cry when they're scared crying will make things worse. Bear growled low, the sound deep in his chest, like thunder trapped behind a wall. Ray glanced at the dog and pointed. "Dog stays." Frank's eyes sharpened. "Dog goes." Ray's jaw flexed. "You want to make this hard?" Frank leaned closer, and the old soldier voice came out, the one that didn't ask twice. "You don't want to see me make it hard." For a moment Ray hesitated. Not because he feared Frank's fists, Frank was old after all, but because there was something about Frank's calm that reminded men of consequences. Ray exhaled through his nose. "Fine. Take the dog. Take your little camping trip. But don't come crawling back." He turned and walked to the door. At the threshold he paused, looking back over his shoulder. "You'll be dead by Christmas," he said, like he was predicting weather. Then he left. The door slammed. The house felt smaller, colder, like the walls had lost the right to stand. Noah swore under his breath, voice shaking. Lily sobbed into her rabbit. Frank stared at the backpacks on the floor. And for a few seconds, his mind went somewhere far away, back to a night in a foreign desert. Back to the sound of boots and orders and the feeling of being disposable. He had promised himself he'd never let kids feel that. Not again. But promises didn't pay heating bills. Promises didn't stop men like Ray. Frank knelt in front of Lily, wiping her tears with his thumb. His hands were rough, but his touch was careful. "Hey," he said softly. "Look at me." Lily's eyes lifted, watery and wide. "Are we gonna die?" she asked. Noah looked away, pretending he didn't need the answer too. Frank swallowed. He didn't lie. Lying was a luxury for warm people. "Not today," he said. Then he stood and looked at Noah. "Pack smart. Warm stuff first. Knife. Rope if you find it. Blankets." Noah nodded, jaw clenched. Bear paced in tight circles, anxious, but staying close. The hour moved fast, cruelly fast. They didn't take toys. They didn't take photos. Frank took the fishing knife, a dented pot, a small tarp from the shed, and matches that felt too few. Noah grabbed blankets and a flashlight with weak batteries. Lily took her rabbit and a pink backpack with a broken zipper, and Frank didn't tell her to leave it behind. Some things weren't negotiable. When they stepped outside, the wind hit them like a slap. The road was frozen dirt, hard as bone. The sky lowered itself, heavy with snow. Frank locked the door out of habit, even though it didn't belong to them anymore. Then he turned away without looking back. Noah's voice was tight. "Where are we going?" Frank looked toward the trees, toward the hills, toward the white unknown. His chest burned with fear, but he kept his face steady because leaders don't get to fall apart first. "Somewhere the wind can't reach us," he said. Bear pressed against his leg, warm and solid, like a reminder that not everything had been stolen. Frank adjusted the heavy pack on his shoulders, felt the weight of 2 children and 1 loyal dog settle onto his life, and he took the first step off the road and into the woods. Behind them, the house stood quiet, and inside it, winter laughed without making a sound. The woods swallowed them the moment Frank stepped off the frozen dirt road, as if the trees had been waiting all along to hide 3 human hearts and 1 loyal animal from the sharp-eyed cruelty of town. Snow clung to every branch like a curse written in white ink, and the wind coming off Lake Superior didn't just blow it hunted, threading through trunks and cutting into exposed skin with the patience of something ancient. Frank Walker kept his pace steady, even when his knees complained and his lungs pulled in air that felt like broken glass. He didn't show pain in front of children. That was a rule older than war. Behind him, Noah trudged with the blankets rolled tight under his arm, his long frame tense like a drawn bow. The boy's cheeks were already raw from cold, but his eyes burned with that stubborn teenage fire, the kind that could keep a person alive or get them killed, depending on the day. Lily walked between them, small boots sinking into powder, her pink backpack bouncing awkwardly against her shoulders. She kept her stuffed rabbit pressed to her chest like it was a beating second heart, and every few steps she glanced back as if the house might suddenly appear again behind them, warm and forgiving, like none of this had happened. Bear moved at Frank's left side, a thick-coated German shepherd with ears pricked forward and amber eyes scanning the woods. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He simply stayed close the way a soldier stays close to his unit, because leaving someone behind was not part of his religion. Frank had seen men break in war. He'd seen them break in marriage. He'd seen them break over money. But Bear was the kind of creature who didn't understand betrayal. He understood only duty, love, and the next step forward. As the light faded, the forest grew quieter, and that silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that made every snap of a twig sound like a gunshot. Frank felt the old instincts rise in him, the ones he'd spent years trying to bury under ordinary life. He kept his hand near the fishing knife tucked into his belt, not because he expected wolves, but because the world had already proven it could bite without teeth. "Where are we going?" Lily asked again, her voice thin as steam. Frank didn't answer right away. He was choosing his words the way a man chooses a path across thin ice. "Somewhere the wind can't reach," he said finally, though even as he spoke it, the wind reached anyway, slapping his face and tugging at his flannel jacket like it wanted to tear it off and claim him. Noah snorted bitterly. "Wind reaches everywhere," he muttered. Frank heard him. He didn't correct him. Sometimes a boy needed to say the truth out loud just to keep from choking on it. They walked until the trees thickened and the land began to rise. The snow grew deeper, soft enough to swallow their footprints, which was good. Frank didn't want anyone following them. Not curious locals. Not Ray's friends. Not some well-meaning busybody who would call the sheriff and turn survival into a spectacle. They weren't a story yet. They were still just three bodies trying not to freeze. When the sky turned bruised purple, Frank finally stopped near a fallen log thick as a coffin. The log lay half buried in snow, its bark split open, and Frank crouched behind it like it was a wall. Bear circled once, sniffing the air, then sat beside Lily, his broad back facing the wind. Lily leaned into his fur without thinking, and Bear accepted it like it was his purpose. Frank pulled the dented pot from his pack and set it near a small hollow he scraped in the snow. He gathered damp branches, snapped them with his hands, and tried to coax a fire from wood that didn't want to burn. The matches were few. Each one felt like a coin from a dying man's pocket. The first match hissed and died. The second flared, then drowned in the wet. Frank's jaw tightened. Noah watched him with a look that wasn't doubt exactly. It was fear wearing doubt's mask. "Let me try," Noah said. Frank shook his head. "You save your fingers." Noah's mouth tightened, but he obeyed. Lily shivered hard enough that her teeth clicked. Frank struck another match, shielding it with his palm. The flame trembled like it was afraid of the world, too. But this time it caught on a strip of dry bark Frank had kept in his pocket, an old habit from hunting trips long ago. The fire grew slowly, weak and stubborn, a tiny orange heart fighting a white death. It didn't give much heat, but it gave light. And light mattered. Frank opened their last can of beans and warmed it just enough to take the bite off. They ate in silence, each swallow sounding too loud. The beans tasted like metal and desperation. Noah kept looking into the woods, his shoulders tight, as if expecting Uncle Ray to appear between the trees and laugh. Lily's eyes drooped with exhaustion, but every time she started to fall asleep, she jerked awake again, startled by the wind. Frank wrapped the blanket around both children and pulled them close. Bear pressed his warm body against Lily's side. Frank sat with his back to the log, knife in hand, staring into darkness until his eyes watered from cold and strain. He didn't sleep much. Veterans didn't sleep easily in the open. In the middle of the night, Bear's head lifted and his ears turned. Frank froze. He listened. Somewhere far off, a branch snapped, then another. Frank's heart thudded once, heavy. He couldn't tell if it was an animal, a person, or just the forest settling. Bear didn't growl. He simply watched. That was somehow worse. Dawn didn't arrive with sunlight. It arrived with more cold, more gray, and snow falling softly like ash. Their footprints from yesterday were gone. Frank took that as a small mercy. Lily's lips were pale, and Noah's fingers were stiff. Frank forced them to move, because stopping was death. They walked deeper into the hills where the land rose into jagged stone, gray stone cliffs that looked like the ribs of a sleeping giant. Frank's breath came out in thick clouds. Each step made his joints ache, but he kept his face calm. He remembered coming here once in summer, years ago, back when his sister was alive, back when Noah and Lily were small enough to chase butterflies instead of survival. Frank had taken them fishing at a creek below these cliffs. He remembered Noah laughing when a fish slipped from his hands. He remembered Lily clapping like the water itself was magic. He remembered himself smiling without effort. That memory hurt more than the cold. "This way," Frank said, voice firm, and led them toward a dark opening in the rock, half hidden by brush and snow. It was there, just like he remembered. A cave mouth, wide and crooked, as if the mountain had opened its jaw and forgotten to close it. Cold air breathed out from inside, not windy, but steady, like a creature exhaling. Lily's hand tightened around Frank's sleeve. "Is it safe?" she whispered. Frank didn't know. He hated that he didn't know, but he also knew the open woods would kill them faster. "Safer than out here," he said. Bear stepped forward first, sniffing the entrance, then walking in without hesitation. Frank watched the dog's body disappear into shadow, and something in his chest loosened. Bear wouldn't go into a place that smelled like death. Not unless there was no choice. They stepped inside. The cave swallowed sound the way snow swallowed footprints. The wind couldn't reach them here. That alone felt like a miracle. The ground sloped downward into a wide chamber, and Frank's boots crunched on ice. Then he saw it. The frozen pond in the center, smooth as glass, stretching wall to wall like a mirror laid down by the gods. Light filtered in from a crack high above, painting the ice faintly blue, so the whole cave looked like a cathedral built for winter itself. Lily stared, eyes wide. "It's pretty," she breathed, as if she felt guilty saying it. Noah looked around, suspicious, like beauty was a trick. Frank felt his throat tighten. It was beautiful, and it was deadly. But for the first time since Ray slammed that door, Frank felt something other than fear. He felt possibility. They moved to the side of the chamber where the rock curved inward, forming a shallow nook that blocked drafts. Frank set their packs down and began working immediately, because if he stopped, he might fall apart. He stacked stones around the tent to steady it, his hands numb but determined. He built a fire pit from flat rocks and dragged branches from outside, his shoulders burning with effort. Noah helped without being asked, gathering smaller sticks, stacking them like a man building a future out of scraps. Lily lined up rocks near the wall, making a neat little row like she was decorating a home. Bear paced the perimeter, sniffing, checking, then finally lying down near the entrance like a guardian statue carved from fur and muscle. When the fire caught, the cave glowed orange, shadows stretching across stone like slow ghosts dancing to a silent drum. Frank stared at that light and felt tears sting his eyes. Not from emotion, he told himself, but from smoke. That was the lie he allowed himself. They ate the last crust of bread and drank melted snow warmed in the dented pot. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Lily fell asleep first, curled against Bear's side, rabbit tucked under her chin. Noah stayed awake longer, staring into the fire with a face too old for 14. "What if Uncle Ray comes back?" he asked quietly. Frank's eyes stayed on the flames. "Then he'll find a man who doesn't beg," Frank said. Noah swallowed. "And what if we don't make it?" Frank's chest tightened. He thought of his sister's laugh, of the funeral dirt, of Lily's small hands, of Noah's anger. He thought of the war, the way men died without meaning, and the way survivors carried that weight like a punishment. Frank leaned forward, voice low and steady. "We make it because we have to," he said. "That's the only reason anyone ever makes it." Outside, the wind screamed against the cliffs like it was furious they'd found shelter. Inside, the cave held them in its cold, ancient mouth. And somewhere beyond the entrance, laughter approached, boots crunching on snow, voices echoing off stone. Frank's spine stiffened. Bear lifted his head, ears sharp. Noah sat up. Lily stirred. The world had found them again. The voices outside the cave didn't come in like rescuers. They came in like winter itself, curious, careless, and certain the world belonged to them. Frank heard boots crunching over snow and stone, then the echo of laughter bouncing down the tunnel, as if the cave enjoyed mocking people back. Bear rose first, silent but tense, his thick German shepherd frame blocking Lily's small body without being told. Frank stood slowly, joints stiff, shoulders heavy beneath the red and black buffalo-plaid flannel jacket that had become his second skin. The fire behind him threw orange light across his face, carving deep lines into his cheeks and catching the gray in his beard. Noah stepped up beside him, skinny but brave, fists clenched like he could punch hunger itself. The two hunters appeared at the mouth of the chamber, their breath steaming in the cold air. One was a tall man with a narrow face and a scraggly blonde beard that looked like it had been chewed by wind, his eyes pale and sharp like a hawk's. His name, Frank would learn later, was Wade Carlson, a man who carried arrogance the way other men carried rifles. The second hunter was shorter and heavier, with a round red nose, a thick brown mustache, and cheeks chapped raw from living outdoors. He looked older than Wade, but acted younger, grinning like cruelty was a joke everyone should enjoy. His name was Hank Dorsey, and his laugh came easy, like he'd never had to pay for it. "Well, I'll be damned," Wade said, voice echoing off the stone. "Look at this, a whole little family den." Hank chuckled, pointing at the tent and the fire pit like they were decorations. "3 cave kids," he said, "and a dog. That's something." Frank didn't move. He didn't bow. He didn't beg. He just stared at them, with that veteran stillness, the kind that made men uncomfortable because it didn't give them anything to push against. "We're not bothering anyone," Frank said, voice low, steady. Wade shrugged. "Ain't that the truth? You'll still be dead by Christmas." Hank laughed again, louder, like he wanted the cave to remember his sound. Noah's face went hot with anger. "Get out," he snapped. Wade's eyes flicked to the boy, amused. "Listen to him. Thinks he's a man." Frank's hand tightened around the fishing knife at his belt, not to threaten, but to remind himself he still had something sharp in a world full of blunt cruelty. Bear let out a low growl, the sound rolling through the cave like distant thunder. Hank's grin faltered for half a second, and he took a small step back. "Easy, mutt," he muttered. Frank's eyes narrowed. "His name is Bear," Frank said, "and he's smarter than both of you." That earned a short bark of laughter from Wade, and then, like boredom had already eaten the moment, the two men turned and walked away, their boots crunching, their voices fading into the tunnel. When they were gone, Noah kicked a rock so hard it skittered across the ice and disappeared into darkness. "They think we're stupid," he said, voice shaking. Lily clutched her rabbit tighter, eyes wide and wet. Frank stared at the frozen pond in the center of the chamber, the surface smooth and blue like a giant eye staring back. "They don't matter," Frank said, but even as he spoke, the words tasted thin. Hunger mattered. Cold mattered. Time mattered. By the next morning, their bread was gone. The last beans had been scraped from the can and licked clean. Frank woke before the kids, his back stiff, his fingers numb, his breath visible in the dim cave light. He stared at the pond, and something old stirred inside him. Memory, stubbornness, and a quiet fury that refused to let his sister's children become a winter statistic. He walked to the ice and knelt, placing his palm on the surface. It was solid, hard as stone. Beneath it, faint shadows moved slow and dark. Fish. Real fish. His father had once taught him to ice fish on a lake back when Frank was a boy. before war taught him different lessons. Frank's mouth tightened. "All right," he whispered to himself. "Then we do it the hard way." He found a rock near the wall, heavy enough to hurt, and brought it down onto the ice. The first strike rang out like a bell. The second made his arms burn. The third sent a crack spidering outward. His shoulders screamed, and for a moment he felt his age like a weight trying to drag him down to the floor. But he kept swinging. Noah woke to the sound and stumbled over, hair messy, face pale. "What are you doing?" he asked. Frank didn't look up. "Making breakfast," he said. Noah knelt beside him without being told, his thin hands grabbing another rock. Lily shuffled over too, rubbing her eyes, her voice small. "Is it loud because it's angry?" Frank almost smiled. "Maybe," he said, "but we're angrier." Together, they struck the ice until finally it gave way with a wet crack, a dark hole opening like a mouth into cold water. Frank's hands were shaking, not from fear, but from pain and cold. He searched his pockets and pulled out a torn bootlace, frayed at the ends. He tied it to a bent paper clip he'd found in the bottom of his pack, shaping it into a crude hook with numb fingers. For bait, he had nothing but a tiny scrap of dried jerky stuck in the corner of a bag. He used it anyway, lowering the line into the hole. The cave fell silent. Even Bear sat still, ears forward, watching the water as if it might speak. Minutes passed. Noah's breath came fast. Lily hugged her rabbit and whispered, "Please," like she was praying to the pond itself. Frank held the line with 2 fingers, feeling for life in the dark. Then something tugged. Not the slow pull of water, but a sharp, living twitch. Frank's heart jumped. He pulled. The line tightened, and suddenly a silver fish burst from the hole, flapping wildly on the ice, scattering droplets like diamonds. Lily screamed, not in fear, but in joy so bright it sounded like sunlight. "He did it!" she cried. Noah laughed, a real laugh, surprised and cracked open, like something warm had finally escaped his chest. Bear barked once, tail thumping the ground, proud as if he'd caught the fish himself. Frank stared at the fish, panting, and felt something unfamiliar rise in him. Not victory, not happiness. Something quieter. Hope. They roasted the fish over the fire, skin sizzling, fat dripping into the flames with a smell so rich it felt like a dream. Frank divided it carefully, giving the softest pieces to Lily first, then Noah, then himself. He ate slowly, letting the warmth spread through his body like medicine. "We can do that again," Noah said, eyes bright. Frank nodded once. "Tomorrow," he replied. That night, the cave didn't feel like a grave. It felt like a shelter that had agreed to let them stay. Days began to blur into a rhythm that kept them alive. Fire, wood, fishing, sleep. Frank woke before dawn every morning, even though dawn looked the same inside the cave, dim, cold, and gray. He learned how to keep the fire alive longer by stacking stones around it and feeding it smaller pieces of wood so it didn't choke itself out. Noah became his shadow, gathering kindling, watching every move Frank made at the pond. Lily helped in her own small ways, lining up stones near the fire pit, as if building a tiny fortress against the world. Bear patrolled the cave entrance, sniffing the air, occasionally stepping outside and returning with snow on his muzzle, like proof he was still guarding them from everything unseen. But even with fish, they weren't safe. They were surviving, barely. The cave still breathed cold. The wind still tried to sneak in. One afternoon, while Frank was dragging branches back from outside, he spotted something half buried under snow and dead leaves near the bluff. A piece of plywood, old and warped, but solid. He stared at it like it was treasure. He hauled it back with both hands, his shoulders straining, boots slipping on ice. Noah ran to help, grabbing the other end. "What is it?" Lily asked. Frank set it down near the tent and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. "A door," he said simply. Noah blinked. "A door to what?" Frank looked around the cave, measuring space the way a carpenter measures wood. "A room," he answered, "inside the cave." That idea changed everything. Frank didn't want them sleeping in open air, even inside stone. He wanted a pocket of warmth, a smaller space that could hold heat like a clenched fist. Over the next days, he and Noah built a frame from branches and thicker sticks, dragging them in piece by piece. Frank used strips torn from an old shirt to tie joints tight, twisting fabric until his fingers ached. They stuffed gaps with dry grass and mud scraped from the cave edges, the mud freezing on their hands like glue. The plywood became a crooked door that squeaked when it moved, but it closed, and that mattered. Lily watched, eyes wide, then began lining stones in a neat row outside the new structure like she was building a front yard. "Our house needs a fence," she declared. And for the first time in weeks, Frank laughed, a small, tired sound, but real. When the cabin was finished, it looked rough, like something desperate hands made under pressure, but it stood. A cabin inside a cave, a strange nesting doll of survival. The first night they slept inside it, the difference was immediate. The fire's warmth lingered longer. The air felt less biting. Noah lay on his back, staring at the low ceiling, and whispered, "It's like a real home." Frank stared at the shadows on the walls, thinking of his sister's kitchen, thinking of Ray's cold eyes, thinking of how quickly a real home could be stolen. "It's a home," Frank said, "because we made it one." Outside, the wind screamed, furious that they had learned how to resist. Inside, the cave cabin held 3 hearts and 1 faithful dog, and for the first time since the door slammed behind them, Frank allowed himself to believe they might last long enough to see spring. Winter didn't arrive like a single punch. It arrived like a slow animal with patience, chewing through hope one day at a time. The cave cabin Frank and Noah had built began to feel less like a clever trick and more like the only reason they were still breathing. The little structure stood crooked but stubborn against the cave wall, its plywood door warped and squeaking like an old man's knee, its seams stuffed with mud and dry grass that cracked when the temperature dropped too low. Inside it, the air stayed just barely warmer than the rest of the chamber, and in a season where barely could mean life, that was enough. Frank woke each morning with stiff fingers and a neck that felt like it had been carved from ice. His red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket never left his shoulders now. He slept in it, worked in it, and sometimes even held Lily with it wrapped around her like a shield. His beard grew rougher, his cheeks more hollow, his eyes sharper with the constant math of survival. How much wood is left? How many matches? How many fish can they pull up before their hands go numb? Noah had changed too. The boy's face looked leaner, angles sharper, as if winter had carved him into someone older. He didn't complain as much anymore. He didn't ask, "What if?" as often. He simply moved, quietly, like he understood that worry was a luxury for warm people. Lily was the one who frightened Frank the most. Not because she cried less now, but because her body started to show the cost. Her coat hung looser on her shoulders, her cheeks lost their color, and when she coughed, It was small and tight, like her lungs were trying to stay hidden from the cold. The first time Frank heard that cough echo inside the cave, fear crawled up his spine like a living thing. It wasn't the dramatic kind of fear, the kind you shout about. It was the quiet fear that makes a man stare at the wall in the dark and think of all the ways a child can slip away. That morning, Frank sat by the pond and chipped away at the ice with a rock, his shoulders burning with every strike. The ice had thickened again, tougher than yesterday, as if winter was rebuilding the barrier just to insult them. Noah knelt beside him, holding the line ready. Bear stood behind them, alert, breath steaming, occasionally pressing his nose to Lily's hair when she sat too still. Lily sat cross-legged near the fire pit, rocking her stuffed rabbit as if it could rock her back into health. "Do you think the fish are hiding from us?" she asked, voice raspy. Frank forced a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Fish don't hide," he said. "They just make you work for it." Noah dropped the line into the dark hole. Minutes passed. Nothing. The cave's silence felt heavier than stone. Noah's hands shook, not from cold alone, but from the terror of emptiness. "What if we don't catch any today?" he whispered. Frank stared into the black water and thought of his sister's face, the way she used to tuck Lily's hair behind her ear. He thought of Ray's voice saying food ain't free. He thought of the hunters laughing. "Then we drink broth," Frank said quietly, "and we try again tomorrow." But he hated how calm his voice sounded, like he was already practicing grief. By late afternoon, they caught one fish, small, thin, barely worth the fight. Frank cooked it slowly, tearing off the softest pieces and feeding Lily first, watching her chew with effort. He warmed water in the dented pot and made a weak broth from fish bones and scraps, letting it simmer until the smell filled the cave like a memory of better days. Lily sipped it, eyes half-lidded. "It tastes like a hug," she murmured. Noah snorted softly, half amused, half broken. Frank felt his throat tighten. "Then drink it all," he said, voice rough. Outside, the wind began to change. It wasn't louder yet. It was different, sharper, more restless, like the sky was pulling its sleeve up before swinging. Bear was the first to notice. His ears pricked. He stood and walked toward the cave entrance, sniffing the air that leaked in through cracks. Then he let out a low, warning growl that made Noah sit up straight. Frank rose slowly, joints protesting, and walked to the mouth of the chamber. Snow was moving outside in a strange way, whipping sideways, swirling in thin white snakes. The trees beyond the entrance blurred as the storm thickened. Frank's stomach tightened. "Inside," he ordered. "Now!" Noah grabbed Lily gently, lifting her like she weighed nothing, and carried her into the cabin. Bear followed close, tail low, body tense. Frank moved fast, dragging rocks from the cave wall, stacking them near the entrance to narrow the opening. His arms shook with effort, but he kept building. He hung the tarp behind the rock barrier, tying it to a crack in the stone with rope that was already fraying. The tarp flapped like a wounded bird, but it cut some of the wind. Snow still pushed in, stinging Frank's face. He slammed the plywood door of the cabin shut and shoved a pile of wood against it as extra weight. Then they huddled together inside their rough little shelter, listening to the storm rage outside like an angry god. Lily coughed into Frank's jacket, small and tight. Frank held her close, rubbing her back with slow, steady pressure, the way his sister used to do when Lily was sick as a toddler. Noah sat with his knees pulled to his chest, jaw clenched, staring at the door as if he could stare winter into submission. Bear lay across the entrance of the cabin like a living barricade, his amber eyes never closing fully. The storm grew louder. Snow pressed against the tarp until it bowed inward. The wind screamed through the cave like it had found a throat. The fire sputtered, struggling for air, and Frank fed it small pieces of wood with shaking hands, trying to keep it alive without choking them with smoke. Then came a sound that didn't belong to wind or fire. A deep crack. Not ice. Stone. The cave shuddered. Dust drifted down from the ceiling in fine gray powder. Lily's eyes flew open wide. "Frank?" she whispered, voice full of terror. Frank's heart slammed against his ribs. For a split second, his mind flashed back to war explosions, collapsing buildings, men shouting names that never got answered. He forced himself to breathe. "It's okay," he lied. Another crack, louder. Then a rumble, low and heavy, like the mountain itself was shifting its weight. Bear sprang up, barking once, sharp and furious, as if he could scare the stone back into place. Noah grabbed Lily's hand. Frank shoved them farther back into the cabin, his body instinctively placing itself between the kids and the door. The rumble grew, and for a terrifying moment Frank thought the whole cave would come down, burying them like a forgotten secret. Then silence. Not peace, just the sudden stopping of motion, like the mountain had decided to spare them. Frank waited, holding his breath. He could hear Lily's tiny breaths, Noah's quick ones, Bear's steady panting. The fire crackled weakly, the only sound brave enough to stay. Frank moved slowly to the door, pushing the wood aside, and opened it just a crack. Cold air rushed in, carrying dust and the sharp scent of broken rock. He stepped out carefully and stared toward the entrance. A pile of stones had fallen near the mouth of the cave, blocking part of the opening. Snow drifted in around it, but the barrier was thick. Frank's chest rose and fell. They weren't crushed. They weren't buried. They were still here. Noah came out behind him, eyes wide. "What happened?" Frank swallowed hard. "The mountain sneezed," he said, trying to make humor out of terror. Noah gave a shaky laugh that sounded like it hurt. Lily stood in the doorway, rabbit clutched tight. "Is the cave mad?" she asked. Frank crouched beside her, brushing dust off her hair. "No," he said. "It's helping." And it was. Because as the storm continued outside, Frank realized something strange. Less wind was coming through now. The fallen stone had narrowed the entrance, and the tarp behind it, though torn, was catching what little air slipped through. The cave felt calmer, still cold, still dangerous, but less like it was being stabbed by wind. Frank stared at the rock pile and felt a bitter kind of gratitude. Winter had tried to kill them again, and somehow even its violence had turned into protection. They spent the rest of the night reinforcing the new barrier. Frank and Noah stacked the fallen rocks tighter, wedging smaller stones into gaps, packing snow and mud where they could. Their hands went numb, but they kept working. Bear stayed close, occasionally nosing a stone into place like he wanted to help. Lily sat by the fire, coughing less now, watching them with sleepy eyes. "We're building a wall," she whispered. "Like a castle." Frank nodded. "A castle for 3, he said. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving the world outside buried and silent. Frank stepped out and felt the cold bite his face, but the wind wasn't as cruel. He dug a path through the snow near the entrance, his flannel jacket dusted white, his beard crusted with ice. When he returned inside, Noah was feeding Lily broth. She looked pale but calmer, her coughing quieter. Frank's chest loosened slightly. Then, late that afternoon, voices echoed again outside the cave. Frank's body stiffened instantly. Noah rose, fists clenched. Bear's ears went up. The hunters were back. Wade Carlson and Hank Dorsey stood near the entrance, but something about them had changed. They weren't laughing as loud. They weren't strolling in like kings. They stared at the rock barrier, at the narrowed mouth of the cave, at the smoke rising faintly from inside. Wade's pale eyes narrowed. "Well, damn," he muttered, almost like he didn't want to admit it. Hank's grin was gone. His mustache twitched as he swallowed. They didn't come farther in. They didn't call them cave kids this time. Wade shifted his weight, scratching his scraggly beard, then reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small sack and tossed it gently toward the entrance. It landed on the snow with a soft thud. "Fish needs seasoning," Wade said, voice rough. Hank looked away, embarrassed, like kindness was something that made his skin itch. "Don't freeze out here," Hank muttered, barely audible. Then they turned and left, boots crunching, voices quiet. Frank stared at the sack, suspicious. Noah picked it up slowly and opened it. Inside was salt. Real salt. Lily blinked at it like it was treasure. Frank's throat tightened again. But this time it wasn't fear. It was the strange ache of realizing people could have helped earlier, but chose not to. Noah whispered, "Why now?" Frank looked toward the tunnel where the hunters had disappeared. "Because now they're starting to believe," he said. He picked up a pinch of salt and rubbed it between his fingers. It felt like a confession. That night, they ate fish with salt, and Lily smiled small, tired, but real. The storm had tried to bury them. The mountain had tried to crush them. And yet here they were, seasoning their survival like it was a meal worth remembering. Frank watched Noah laugh softly at Lily's castle talk, watched Bear's tail thump against the cabin wall, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something dangerous bloom inside him. Not just hope, but pride. Winter hadn't won. Not tonight. Not yet. Spring didn't arrive with trumpets or bright skies in Duluth. It arrived like a tired question, whispered through melting snow and dripping stone. Frank noticed it first in the cave's ceiling, where water began to fall in slow, steady drops into the pond, making soft circles that spread and vanished like time itself. The air didn't feel warm yet, not truly, but it felt different, less murderous, less sharp. The wind outside still had teeth, but they weren't as long. One morning, Frank stood at the cave entrance, his red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket dusted with damp grit, and felt something he hadn't felt in months. Air that didn't slice his lungs open. It touched his face like a cautious hand, almost gentle. Behind him, Noah was stacking firewood in neat rows, the way he'd learned to stack his thoughts, tight, controlled, prepared. Lily sat on the bench they'd built, her rabbit in her lap, watching a drip fall from the ceiling like it was a tiny miracle. Bear stood beside Frank, ears up, nose lifted, smelling the world changing. The cave cabins still creaked at night, still held their smoke, still carried the scent of fish and survival. But the cave no longer felt like a trap. It felt like a place that had done its job. Frank should have felt relief. Instead, he felt something heavier settling into his chest. The fear of what came after. All winter, the plan had been simple: don't die. Now spring was forcing a new plan, one that required talking to people again, trusting strangers, stepping back into a town that had let them disappear. Noah sensed it too. He didn't say much, but his eyes followed Frank whenever Frank stared too long down the slope toward the distant rooftops. Lily asked it out loud, because children don't know how to hide questions inside their ribs. "Are we staying here forever?" she asked one evening, voice small but steady. Frank looked at her, at the way her cheeks had finally filled out again from better fishing days, at the way her cough had faded into memory, and he forced a smile. "Not forever," he said. "Just long enough." "Long enough for what?" Noah asked, sharper. Frank stared into the fire. "For winter to stop chasing us," he answered. Noah's mouth twisted. "Winter already lost," he muttered. Frank wanted to believe that. But winter wasn't the only enemy. Pride was. People were. And the worst enemy of all was the part of the world that pretended it didn't see suffering until it became a story worth telling. The first visitors came quietly. Frank heard them before he saw them. Boots on rock, voices carrying through the trees. Not hunters this time. Younger voices, curious, excited. Two teenage boys appeared near the cave entrance one afternoon, while Frank was gathering branches. They were town kids, soft-faced and clean, dressed in bright jackets that looked too new for real hardship. One was tall and lanky with sandy hair poking out from under a beanie, freckles scattered across his nose like spilled pepper. His name was Tyler Benson, and he had the restless energy of someone who'd never been hungry long enough to learn silence. The other boy was shorter, with a rounder face and dark hair shaved close on the sides, his eyes quick and bold. His name was Marcus Hale, and he had the grin of a kid who thought danger was entertainment. They froze when Frank stepped out of the shadows, and for a second, they looked like deer caught in headlights. "Whoa," Tyler blurted. "Didn't know anyone actually lived here." Marcus pointed toward the cave like it was a haunted attraction. "You're the cave guy, right? My uncle said kids lived up here all winter. Thought he was messing with me." Frank's shoulders stiffened. He didn't like the way the boys looked past him, trying to see Noah and Lily. "We live here," Frank said flatly. Noah stepped into view behind him, jaw tight. Lily peeked from the cabin door, clutching her rabbit. Tyler's eyes widened. "You guys really stayed?" Marcus breathed, suddenly less amused. "All winter?" Noah answered before Frank could stop him. "Yeah," he said, voice hard. "All winter." The boys left quickly after that, talking fast, their voices bright with disbelief. Frank watched them go and felt the cold creep back into his bones, not from weather, but from certainty. "Now people will come," he murmured, and they did. At first it was a few men from town, older, heavier, wearing work coats and suspicious expressions. They didn't step deep into the cave. They stood near the entrance, staring as if the cave was a miracle and a shame at the same time. Some asked questions like they were entitled to answers. "How'd you eat? How'd you keep warm? Where were you sleeping?" Frank answered short and careful, his voice giving nothing away. He didn't trust their curiosity. Curiosity had never saved anyone. Then the gifts started appearing, left like offerings at the mouth of a temple. A sack of flour, a box of canned soup, an old blanket folded neatly, a jar of peanut butter with a spoon taped to the lid. No names, no apologies, just supplies, dropped quietly as if kindness was something that embarrassed them. Noah wanted to believe it. He held a can in his hands one night and said, "Maybe they're finally helping." Frank took the can, turned it over, checked the seal, sniffed it like a man sniffing for poison. Maybe, he said. Or maybe they just don't want to feel guilty anymore. Lily, innocent and tired of hunger, hugged the blanket to her chest like it was a teddy bear. It's soft, she whispered, eyes shining. Frank couldn't bring himself to ruin that moment with bitterness. He only nodded and said, "Then we'll use it." A week into spring's slow thaw, the person Frank least wanted to see appeared at the cave entrance like a shadow returning. Ray. Uncle Ray looked smaller than Frank remembered, as if winter had stolen some of his weight. His beard was thicker, untrimmed, and his face was drawn tight, the skin around his eyes creased with stress. He wore the same work jacket, but it looked worn now, less like armor and more like a burden. He stopped near the rock barrier and stared into the cave with a strange expression, part disbelief, part annoyance, part something that might have been regret if he'd known how to wear it. Lily's hand clamped around Frank's sleeve. "That's him," she whispered, voice trembling. Noah stepped forward like a guard dog, eyes burning. Frank's heart didn't race. It hardened. Ray cleared his throat. "You're still alive," he said, as if survival had been an insult to his prediction. Frank didn't move. "Why are you here?" he asked. Ray glanced at the racks of fish hanging near the fire, the cabin walls, the stacked wood. His jaw worked. "People in town been talking," he said. "Sheriff heard. Thought you might be dead." Noah's voice cut through the air like a blade. "We weren't." Ray nodded slowly, as if he didn't know what to do with that fact. "You can come back now," he said. "Town's warming up. I got room." Frank laughed once, sharp and bitter. "Now you got room," he repeated. Ray's eyes flashed. "Don't get smart." Frank stepped forward, the buffalo plaid jacket bright against the gray stone, his old veteran face carved with exhaustion and resolve. "You threw children out in winter," Frank said, voice low but steady. "You called them a burden." Ray looked away, the way weak men do when truth is too heavy. "I did what I had to," he muttered. Frank's eyes narrowed. "So did I," he replied. Lily's small voice rose behind him, quiet but fierce. "We don't need him." Ray's gaze flicked to her, and for a heartbeat his expression cracked. He sighed, rubbing his forehead like he had a headache made of consequences. "You don't belong in a cave," he said, softer. Frank's reply was simple. "We belong where we don't freeze." Ray stood there another second, then turned and walked away without looking back, boots crunching like shame underfoot. Frank watched him disappear and felt no triumph, only a hollow ache. He didn't want revenge. He wanted justice, and justice rarely came with warmth. 2 days later, the sheriff came. He couldn't drive his truck up the slope, so he walked, hat in hand, breath puffing in the cool air. Sheriff Daniel Mercer was a tall man in his 50s with a lined face and a tired kindness that looked earned, not performed. His hair was graying at the temples, and his eyes held the weight of a job that made you witness too many broken families. He stopped at the cave entrance and looked around slowly, taking in the cabin walls, the fish racks, the fire pit blackened with months of smoke. "Frank Walker," he said, voice respectful. Frank nodded once. "Sheriff?" Mercer swallowed, his gaze flicking to Noah and Lily. "You kids been through hell," he said quietly. "Town's been looking for you." Noah's laugh was sharp. "Not hard enough." The sheriff winced like the words hit him physically. We didn't know where you went, Mercer said. Frank's eyes stayed steady. We weren't lost, he replied. The sheriff exhaled, then stepped closer, careful not to invade. This ain't how kids are supposed to live, he said gently. Noah's voice cracked, and for the first time in a long time, Frank heard the boy's fear without anger covering it. But we lived, Noah said. Mercer's mouth tightened, sadness softening his face. Yeah, he murmured. You did. He spoke then about school, about foster care, about options. Lily clung to Frank's jacket and whispered, I don't want to go. Frank wrapped an arm around her, feeling the bones of her shoulders under thin fabric. We're not going tonight, he said firmly. The sheriff nodded. I'll come back, he promised. In a few days. We need a plan. That word plan stuck in Frank's mind like a thorn. All winter, the plan had been survival. Now the plan meant surrendering control to a world that had failed them once already. That night, after the sheriff left, the cave felt smaller. The fire seemed weaker. Noah poked at it with a stick, jaw tight. They're going to take us, he whispered. Frank shook his head slowly. Not like Ray did, he said. Noah's eyes flashed. How do you know? Frank looked at Lily, at Bear curled beside her like a guardian carved from loyalty, and felt the weight of being the last wall between them and the world. Because I won't let them, he said. But when the cave went quiet and the dripping water echoed like a ticking clock, doubt crept into Frank's chest anyway. Not doubt about love, doubt about power. He had fought wars, but he had never fought paperwork. He stepped outside alone and sat on a rock overlooking the valley. The town lights flickered faintly in the distance like distant stars. Behind him, the cave glowed orange, warm and stubborn. Ahead of him, the world waited, and Frank realized the hardest part of winter wasn't the cold. It was deciding when to leave the place that had saved you. Sometimes the miracle doesn't come as a bright light in the sky or a sudden rescue at the perfect moment. Sometimes it comes as a stubborn old veteran in a red and black flannel jacket refusing to let 2 children be swallowed by winter. Sometimes it comes as a loyal German shepherd laying his body between the cold and the ones he loves. And sometimes it comes in the smallest things, one fish pulled from dark water, one warm breath in the night, one more morning where hearts are still beating. That's how God works more often than people admit. Not always by removing the storm, but by giving someone the strength to stand inside it and say, not today. This story reminds us that life will test every person in quiet ways, through bills, through loss, through rejection, through days when the world feels cold, even when the sun is out. But the same God who carried Frank, Noah, and Lily through that frozen cave can carry anyone through the hard seasons of everyday life, too. So if you're going through your own winter right now, whether it's loneliness, stress, family struggles, or fear about the future, remember this: you don't have to be the strongest person in the world. You just have to keep going one day at a time and trust that God is still writing your story. And if this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from and what part of this story hit you the hardest, because your words might be the encouragement someone else is praying for. Thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting these stories. And may God bless you, protect you, and keep your home warm in every season. Amen.